This locomotive is known as Coffee Pot, although that isn't its formal name. It was built in 1871, and that's why this year we're marking its 150th anniversary. And it's particularly nice that we can mark that with a locomotive in working order, and probably one of the oldest locomotives certainly working in the Northern Hemisphere, and if you exclude heavy rebuilds, it's probably amongst the sort of top 5 oldest working steam engines in the world. So it's built in 1871 by Head Wrightson, who are a company based on Teesside at Thornaby. But it was actually supplied by an agent, T.H. Head of London, who was connected with the company. But that's why the locomotive carries the plate on the tank side, which you can see behind me, T.H. Head, and has for many years confused people as to what the origins of this locomotive really were. So it was supplied new to the Dorking Greystone Lime Company, who had a quarry at Betchworth in Surrey, and this had a branch line that connected with the main line, which I think was the South Eastern Chatham Railway. And it was used for shunting wagons of lime down from the quarry to the exchange sidings when the lime would be shipped out. So there are two stages in that journey. Obviously the lime was taken out of the hillside, and then it was processed before it was sent away as a product for use on the land in particular. So Coffee Pot was supplied to them, and we have copies of the original order which make quite interesting reading, not least because I think there was a naivety in its operation, because they'd probably operated with horses previously. And one of the things they requested was a toolkit, and it lists in the toolkit what they would want, and it really is your kind of your beginner's guide to steam locomotives, really. You know, you open your kit of spanners and oiling syringes and so on, and because of that list we were able to recreate the contents of the toolbox reasonably accurately when we restored the locomotive in 2010. So the toolbox itself is based on a photograph, but the contents generally are based on some documentary evidence that survived. So the loco arrived at Betchworth, probably delivered by rail, and within the first couple of years they added these handrails, and you can see if you were standing on the locomotive why it might be quite a precarious position otherwise, and there was perhaps good reason. Even in 1871-ish, health and safety was being considered. However, it was the least of its problems, because within about 2 years it required a new boiler, and eventually it would carry 5 boilers, this being the 5th. Now, mentioning that naivety in terms of perhaps understanding steam locomotives, and the fact that they very quickly bought additional locomotives, it does suggest that they had some problems with it. Now, these are unlikely to have been technical. They're probably to do with the high lime content of the water that you would obviously find in that area. So new boilers were purchased, and they generally went through a series of second-hand boilers that were sort of added, and the engine was tailored to fit them. So by the time it was withdrawn, probably around 1949, after a very hard life in the quarry, it was something of a kind of mix of what it had originally been. And when we restored it for the 2010 completion, we retained the handrails that had been added within the first 2 years, but we went for a boiler design that reflected as built. So really this is the locomotive as it would have appeared up to about 1873. After that the boilers were changed, and there's not as much documentary or photographic evidence of what was then carried until the 1920s. Interestingly, the loco, and Matt will talk to you about this in due course, was based on a single piece cast iron frame, which did generate some problems, I think, when they were setting it up at the manufacturers. But also over the years we see odd little things that when you study photographs, as those of us who are that way inclined to do, you start counting the spokes on wheels, and you realise that the wheels aren't the same wheels as it was built with. Six spokes originally, later 5, and then back to 6, which is a mystery that hasn't been solved. And my assumption is the wheels were replaced at some point, and they were later, when the replacements wore out, they retired the originals and they went back on, because these are quite an interesting pattern and very much distinctive to Head Wrightson, so probably originated from that source. So, as I say, it worked till 1949, or thereabouts. It was inspected in 1950 and 51 for steam tests, but it's not known if it actually operated from that point, and certainly photographs suggest it probably wasn't capable of being. And they had a far better locomotive for the quarry by that point. It languished for a while before Head Wrightson, who were reflecting on their own history, started buying up what they could of their own heritage. So this is back in the 60s. It's quite an enlightened view. And they eventually acquired 3 locomotives that they'd built. 2 of them were ex-Seaham Harbour, and then there was this one. One of them was 1870, then 1873, and obviously this example was 1871. And as a result of that, we've got quite a nice snapshot of a Teesside manufacture with probably 1/3 to 1/2 of its motive power output all still in the region. So the other locomotives, one is at Beamish here, and another one is at Stockton. So it was cosmetically restored by apprentices, and they tried to turn it back to something as it would have looked, which was a kind of approximation. Eventually it was presented to Beamish, and it came to us via storage at Concert Ironworks, then Marley Hill on the Tamfield Railway, eventually arriving here in 1975. In 1978 it was back in steam, albeit it was kind of extending what was left of its life from Betchworth really. But it wasn't until 1984, when it was fully overhauled at ICI Wilton by apprentices, that it really kind of gained a new lease of life. And a lot of that restoration we were able to utilise when we rebuilt it from 2006 onwards. So out of use by certainly into the early 90s. Some thoughts that it was kind of, you know, to the late 90s, never really been able to pin down exactly when it was last used. It was just displayed within the engine shed at the museum. And when I started in 2004, it was kind of semi-dismantled, and some experimentation had been carried out on it with regard to looking at blind bushing on the boilers, which sounds fairly dull and tedious, but it's quite significant to locomotives that has things attached to the boilers. So as an early kind of win really, sort of picking off the low-hanging fruit, we decided to restore this locomotive. We had Your Heritage grant support from the lottery, as was at the time, and that was to the tune of nearly £50,000. We then had a number of other bodies give us funds for things like drawings, boiler design, so on and so forth, and the assistance of volunteers, in particular a chap called Dave Young, who became a very significant part of our output in the last 10 years, and Dave and I really met through this project. Decided it was a reasonable timescale to say aim for 2010, and we achieved that. And as part of the process, a new boiler was designed and built, and this was based on one of the Seaham locomotives, which had survived, because obviously this was some boilers away from its original by that time. And we were able, because of Dave's input really, to enhance the restoration. So Dave did the pump at home, he made patterns for new fittings. One of the piece we met over was the regulator quadrant, which was completely non-usable, and he made a pattern and we had a new one cast, which he machined. So as we got to know each other, we kind of sort of set the bar higher and higher in terms of the standard of restoration, and really that's what you see today. So it's been running since 2010, it has been retubed in that time. It's a peculiar engine. I don't think it's particularly popular in terms of driving. Matt might say otherwise later. I love it, but it is a little bit of an acquired love or habit, whichever the two you prefer. It's interesting to many people who've come and had a go on it, because it has a boiler feed pump, which is quite unusual on steam locomotives in the UK. And as you can see, just sat here, it's idling away, gently trickling water into the boiler. And it can sit like that all day, or you can kind of run the water up the glass in seconds, depending. Probably too large a pump for this loco, but we do know one was fitted originally, although we have no idea of the pattern. And later 2 injectors were fitted, and we've made allowance for fitting injectors in the future should we decide to do that. So taking you round it, you start with the water tank, then you've got the engine unit, then the boiler footplate, and then they would call these coke boxes, because as locomotives would be burning coke usually in that period, but a bunker of coal to all intents and purposes, and then our beloved toolbox. So new boiler has really enabled us to kind of give it a new lease of life and have confidence in it operating, and we were keen it would run in 2021 because it's 150th anniversary. But basically that's kind of Coffee Pot in a nutshell. If you want to read more, you can find a full 3-part article on the blog which charts the history in more detail, but I'll hand you over to Matt, who's going to kind of go around the engine and give you some of the technical background.
After looking at the history of the engine, we'll have a look at how the engine's built and how it's operated. I'm going to try and do this in layman's terms so that the majority of people watching this will understand it. So apologies to those who've tuned in from the Twitter Steam Rally and know all about steam locomotives. This is probably the bit you want to go find something else to watch. So part of the reason we operate these engines is it gives us an insight into what the operators dealt with when they were running them. And you've really got to wonder with this engine why it lasted so long, because I don't particularly like working on this engine. I don't find it comfortable. That said, you can see the advantages of it. So I'll take you through its construction and we'll have a look at some of the advantages and disadvantages. So Paul explained about the one-piece cast frame. So this is a massive casting, and this would have been made by creating a mould in sand and then poured molten into the mould, and that's the entire length of the engine and the entire width of it, one piece, and then the boiler sits in that. So that's excellent, it works really well. The downsides of that is that castings are very strong in compression but not in tension, so we have to be a little bit careful what we do with the engine, because we don't want to stress it and end up breaking the casting by essentially pulling it apart. So we are a little bit careful with how well we load it, because there'd be no hope really of getting a new one or repairing it if we broke it. The vertical boiler, which is in the middle here, that's a peculiar thing. Most steam railway locomotives have a horizontal boiler. So most steam engines, the round bit's horizontal, fire at one end. This one's slightly different. The fire's at the bottom down here. The water's round the fire, and then above it there's tubes that carry the exhaust from the fire up through the water to give more heating area, and then out to the top. And that's probably the main advantage of this engine, because fire naturally wants to go up, heat rises. This boiler is incredibly efficient at creating steam, and actually from cold it makes steam really quickly because of that efficiency. So that's probably one of the advantages the operators found with it, was that from start of the day to the point you can start doing something, this engine is comparatively quick. Another peculiar feature of this engine that you don't find on others is that the cylinders, the motive power for the locomotive, are also vertical. They work up and down rather than along the length of the engine. They're mounted to the boiler as well. Again, on railway engines that's particularly peculiar. And they drive not directly onto the wheels, they drive a second crankshaft which is about here. So this engine can actually be run without moving the engine. The engine can move out of gear, much like your car can when you stood at traffic lights. When you want to move the engine, you have to put it in gear. That process is a little bit more complicated than your car, and it only has one gear, so that's it. And the gear ratio between the engine and the wheels means that when this engine's moving, it sounds like it's going really fast, but it's hardly moving at all. On a normal steam locomotive with 2 cylinders, you have 4 chuffs per wheel revolution. On Coffee Pot, you have 12. So you hear it coming, and you think it's coming around the corner really fast, and then it appears at its sedate pace. The last, well, I say the last, there is other peculiar features, but the last one I'm going to look at. This peculiar feature on the side. Most steam locomotives in the UK have injectors, which are a clever device which work with steam and water to force steam into the boiler under pressure. And they do that with no moving parts. Coffee Pot doesn't have injectors. Coffee Pot has this water pump, which is quite nice to just watch as it's doing its thing. But this pumps water into the boiler under pressure. All our visiting crews visit Beamish, they all want to go on Coffee Pot. They tolerate it for a day, and the feature that everybody talks about when they get off it is how good the water pump is and why doesn't every engine have one. None of them want every engine to have the regulator that this has. That's particularly awkward to use, but they all want a water pump on their engine. So that's the workings of Coffee